Today, I'm going to explore with you the institution of slavery. Just what exactly are the historical roots of this institution in the United States? How did slaves come to be there? Why they continue to exist um, in the United States in the 19th century, where slavery has been banned in many European colonial countries, in particular, of course, Great Britain. How is it that they persist to exist in the United States right into the 1860s? And how important is this institution, and how deeply seated is it to lead to people killing each other over the question of slavery and its possible abolition? First of all, let me paint you a picture, a statistical one, of just exactly how many slaves there were in the United States. Um, these are the slave statistics for 1860, based on US Census reports. This will be a year before the Civil War begins, so it's the last year of uncontested slavery. The American population, it consists at that point of 31.5 million Americans, of whom 3.9, nearly 4 million, are slaves. 12.5% of the American population is enslaved. 27.5 million Americans are free, of which roughly 488,000, or half a million, are Black. So 12% of the total African American Black population. Approximately 1 in 70 Americans owned slaves, or 1.5% of the free American population owned slaves. In the South, the statistic is a little bit higher. 4.8% of Southerners owned one or more slaves. So no more than 5% of Southerners actually owned slaves. So the rest, essentially the remaining 95% of Southerners, would have fought and died for the small 5% minority for their right to own slaves. The 1860 U.S. Census, there are 393 and 975 named persons who hold 3,950,546 unnamed slaves, a mathematical average of about 10 slaves per holder, but in reality, most actually held only one or two slaves. Owners of 200 or more slaves equaled less than 1% of all slaveholders. So those gone with the wind images of plantations with dozens or hundreds of slaves working away in the fields was really not representative of slave owning in the South. As I say, majority of slaveholders had only one or two slaves. So with 1% of all slaveholders holding 200 or more slaves, that's fewer than 4,000 persons, or 1 in every 7,000 free persons. You know, not even 1/100th of a percent. So this small group of 4,000 individuals held an estimate of 20 to 30% of all slaves, 800,000 to 1,200,000 slaves. And that, of course, is typical of wealth. Wealth, as is highly concentrated in the hands of a very small minority, the infamous 1%, and certainly in terms of slaveholders, it was even much less than 1%. Those slaves, as I say, were concentrated in the hands of a small 4,000 person minority whose interests are going to be defended to the death in the Civil War. African Americans, free African Americans, owned slaves. In fact, 28% of free blacks in New Orleans owned slaves. There were, in the 1860 census, at least 6 African Americans in Louisiana who owned 65 or more slaves. They were part of that 1% minority elite. In Charleston, South Carolina, in 1860, 125 free blacks owned slaves, 6 of them owning 10 or more. Of the $1.5 million in taxable property owned by free African Americans in Charleston, more than $300,000 worth, about 20% of it, represented slave holdings. So slavery essentially is ubiquitous in the United States, and slave owning in the United States crossed racial lines. Most of these slaves arrived in a generation between 1520 and 1870 of transatlantic slave shipments, the so-called transatlantic slave trade. There were approximately 40,000 of these slave shipments. Although certainly by the 1800s, very few slaves in the United States came directly from Africa. Most were natural-born Americans. They were born in slavery, lived in slavery, and died in slavery. Often there were now generations of slaves who had descendants born in slavery, and so certainly by the middle of the 19th century, aside from some slaves being smuggled from the Caribbean, most of the American slaves were natural born. And of course, we'll see that the transatlantic and the international slave trade gets banned at the end of actually the 18th century. These 40,000 slave shipments between, as I say, 1520 and 1870, they represent approximately 11 million Africans transported as slaves, of whom 9.5 million survived the voyages. So there's a 15% fatality among the slaves who are being transported. I should note as well, there is a 15% fatality among crews working on slave ships. So whatever is killing the slaves is also killing the crew. About 361,000, or 3.8% of all of these slaves, actually were directed to mainland North America, primarily Virginia and the Carolinas, which of course are going to become the United States. So a only small sliver of this international slave trade actually arrives on the shore of what will become the United States. Approximately 27,000 slave voyages, representing an estimated 2/3 of the total, had been carefully documented, cataloged, and calculated by essentially corporate accountants. The slave trade is one of the earliest corporate operations. Its slave missions were among the earliest publicly traded company enterprises in which people would invest, in which people bought shares and traded. And so everything would have been meticulously documented and recorded. These account books, as I said, remained in corporate records. They were part of the corporate archive, part of their calculation of income, payment of dividends on investor shares in the slave trade. And here you see an example of the kind of, a little bit enlarged for you. You can see slaves here are given a name. Their skill is indicated. You can see, for example, bricklayer, carpenter. Those that aren't skilled are indicated as just labor. In fact, that you can see sailor. Again, bricklayer, smith's boy. I imagine that's an assistant to a tinsmith. Bricklayer again, so forth. Their ages ranges from 7. In this case, it's a doctor's boy. They're as old as 65, 49, age 13, 41. So they range in age. And then finally, their condition is indicated. Good or superior, super. I don't imagine you'll see in the books a slave that's marked as, bad condition. So this is from 1776, April. These are all males. Here you can see females as well. Women, labor. I can't quite make out some of the handwritten text here, but you can see how carefully records were kept. So indeed, we have about 27,000 slave voyages for whom these kinds of financial records have survived as inventory, corporate inventory reports, essentially. When we look at where did all the other millions of slaves go, well, 4 million go to Brazil, primarily sent there by the Portuguese. 2.5 million go to the Spanish Empire, including what is today Cuba. 2 million to the British West Indies, Barbados, Jamaica. 1.2 million to the French West Indies, to places like Haiti, for example. And again, 360,000 to North America. So slavery in North America is just a sliver of slave practice in this hemisphere. Slavery has been ubiquitous in almost every culture and civilization, primitive or advanced. It existed in the classic world. It existed in the medieval era. It existed in the Middle East and in Asia. It existed among indigenous tribes of both North and South America. It existed in Africa itself long before Europeans arrived, and it existed among indigenous tribes in the Arctic Circle. It was a common human practice of warfare and conquest. It is, as I say, ubiquitous in the human existence. It's only in the last, say, 2.5 centuries that begun to regard slavery as something negative. Until then, it has been inherent in virtually every single culture. The Greeks and Romans practiced slavery extensively, and they instituted a whole complex of slave laws that not only regulated the behavior of slaves, but as well as the behavior of their masters. The behavior of masters is essential in a slave society to be regulated, because one of the things that slave societies fear most is a slave revolt. And the more slaves there are, the more there is this kind of fear. So certainly by the 1st century AD, in the modern era, the Romans had implemented slave courts, for example, implemented a code of rights that a slave has in order to prevent kind of slave uprisings of the type that, the Spartacus uprising of gladiators is one of the infamous slave uprisings in Roman history. And so Imperial Rome sought a structure and a regulatory system that gave slaves an opportunity to vent their discord in a legal forum without necessarily maybe having to revolt. For example, by late Roman era, slaves could not be, for example, put into gladiatorial games where their life is at risk without a court order. A slave owner could not kill his own slave unless, again, a Roman court had given him a verdict and permission to do this. And so, as I say, in the Roman era, slavery was highly regulated. Constantine, he of course is the first Roman emperor to officially sanction Christianity. All sorts of old Roman institutions died under Constantine as he brought in a new era. But the one thing that early Christians and their pagan rivals agreed upon was slavery. Slavery persisted. And when you look at the biblical scriptures, Christ or his disciples do not whisper a word on behalf of slaves. And in fact, this was the reason that we'll find that Christian churches in their early period, while granting refuge to fugitive criminals or murderers, turned away escaping slaves. The early Christians owned slaves. There are references to slaves in the scriptures. St. Paul, for example, admonishes slaves to be obedient to their owners. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5, quote, "Be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling in singleness of your heart, as unto Christ." You often see references to servants in Bible texts. This is kind of a unfortunate English translation from the old Greco-Latin original texts of the Bible, where the word servus, meaning slave, is anglicized as servant. And so when you read in the Bible servants, just substitute the word slave to get its essential meaning. In biblical terms, servant does not mean like the butler that brings you your cocktail at bedtime. It means slaves. The Bible, for example, reproduces a letter from St. Paul accompanying a slave that he had borrowed, and he's returning the slave to the master. And St. Paul essentially says, look, this slave is useless to me, but please don't punish him severely. You'll find that passage in the epistle of Paul to Philemon. And we're going to see, in fact, that early Christian silence and certainly Christ's silence on slavery are often cited in the 19th century by slave owners for the justification of slavery in the South. There is as well some biblical roots to what will become modern racialization of slavery, rooted in what we know as the Hamitic myth. The Hamitic myth is a passage in the Old Testament, Genesis, Genesis chapter 9, verse 18. It's a parable of the three sons of Noah, who are called Japheth, Shem, and Ham. And here you can see in this 19th century biblical illustration, as we move from Japheth, Shem to Ham, you can see that they're progressively getting darker. Their skin is darker, their hair is darker, with Ham being the darkest. Now, the way the parable goes is, and it's a strange parable, Noah drinks too much wine and he falls asleep, passes out in his tent. As he's kind of kicking and turning in his sleep, he disrobes himself and he exposes himself naked. His son, Ham, sees this and thinks it's funny. And so he calls over his two brothers, Japheth and Shem, or Sem, and points out, look, Dad's all exposed. Isn't that funny? Noah suddenly awakes at this moment and is enraged with his son's kind of humiliation of him. And Noah now condemns Ham and his descendants to forever wander in darkness, hopelessly, never finding a home. And this biblical parable by the medieval age becomes known as the Table of Nations. And here you can see a medieval manuscript with the Table of Nations illustrated. And you can see that the sons of Sem represent Asia. And in fact, we get the term anti-Semitism or Semitic from Sem. It essentially applies to anybody across the Dardanelles, starting from Turkey all the way into what is Asia. On the left, you see there are the European, Europa, the white sons of Japheth. And then on the right in this Table of Nations, you see Cham or Ham, thus the Hamitic myth, the sons, the African sons of Ham, who, by virtue of having been cursed by Noah, are now open to be captured as slaves. This is the so-called Hamitic myth. And if you read Civil War religious literature or even newspaper propaganda in the South during the slave period, African slaves are often referred to as the sons of Ham in this kind of pro-slavery literature. It's an excuse as to why, in particular, Africans are more susceptible to slavery. When the Roman Empire eventually collapses and the rest of its ancient institutions and families and traditions vanish, slavery is essentially the only institution that survives. Anglo-Saxon monarchs captured Celtic slaves, Franks seized Breton slaves or Aquitanian Goths. Throughout the Dark Ages in Europe, slave markets flourished and operated from Spain all the way to northern France. Slavery in northern Europe will begin to fade with the rise of the feudal system. And we're not quite unclear why this is, but we can hazard a good guess. First of all, if you have slaves, and most economies at that point are agrarian agricultural economies, in Europe, the northern climates are getting progressively colder. Winters are becoming impossible to plant things and harvest agricultural crops. And therefore, slave owners now have all these slaves that they have to feed and take care of while the slaves aren't working. And as I said earlier, in I think my previous lecture, if you don't take care of your slave, you own a slave, and you don't take care of them when they're not working, when it comes time to work and they're in no condition to work, then it's useless. And so the suggestion is that slave owners essentially became landlords. That's how we still pay the rent to our landlord. That instead of owning slaves, slaves would become tenants on a landlord's property and or sharecroppers, and they would just pay rent or a share of the crops that they raise and harvest to the landlord, and thus you have the emergence of kind of the feudal system that will characterize medieval up to Renaissance era Europe until the industrial age. It's just economically more feasible in northern climates. And that may be the reason, too, when we get to the United States, why the North is industrializing and abolishing slavery, while the South continues to maintain slavery. It's a question of climate. If you're using slaves, as I say, for agricultural production. There's other reasons. New technology begins to render slaves useless. Water mills, frontal yokes, larger cart horses, iron tools, all these things now begin to diminish the value of slave labor. There are also, kind of in the Dark Ages, there are insufficient foreign wars to garner captured slaves. And as well, there's some speculation that there were as well multiple slave revolts in the North that made the maintenance of slavery just a risky thing. In addition to this, Christianity begins to transform. There's a new penitent Christianity that has a role to play. In 1649, the Carolingian King Clovis II marries an Anglo-Saxon slave, Bathilda, and as the king's wife, Bathilda, begins um, to lobby for the abolition of the slave trade and for the freeing of slaves. And of course, Bathilda or Matilda, um, she is eventually deified, and she's known as Saint Matilda. Saint Matilda, she's the patron saint of slaves to this day. In southern Europe, in the warmer climate, slavery persists for two reasons. Partly, again, because of the climate, partly because it begins to share the Mediterranean Sea and the region with the Islamic world. Venice, for example, is one of the centers of um, southern European slave trades. You're looking at the Viva di Schiave, which is the I guess we can call it the slave docks. This is where merchants would bring slaves for sale to Europeans. Venice, in particularly, was a slave society. You can see in its architecture and its decorative arts references to slaves. There were slave gondoliers, for example, African slaves. African slaves were particularly valued and prized in the Islamic world among Arabs, and certainly in the Mediterranean world as well. The darker a slave's skin, the more valuable he'd be as a slave. And of course, in Venice, you even have this kind of motif in jewelry of a slave pin brooch. Islam, like Christianity, accepted slavery as an unquestionable part of the human organization. Muhammad, the founder of Islam, he essentially took over the system of slavery in which ancient society had been based. Slavery under Islam was regulated to a great extent, as in the late Roman Empire. Slaves were to be properly nourished. Slave children in the Islamic slave trade were not to be separated from their mothers until the age of 7. Slaves were not to be treated as animals. The ownership of slaves was carefully regulated. For example, in fact, Christians living in Islamic societies could not keep black slaves. That was strictly reserved only for those in the Islamic faith. Nor could, of course, a Christian keep a slave who is a Muslim, nor a fellow Muslims. As much as Islam accepted slavery, of course, Muhammad in the Quran essentially says that the most noble thing any slave owner can do is to liberate his slave, although it's not a requirement. And technically, slavery is still recognized as a state in traditional Islam. Islamic slave traders built an extensive slave trading business, prior to the Atlantic slave trade. It lasted into the 20th century. As many as 10 million Africans ended up being deported, captured and deported as slaves by Islamic traders who would be trading these slaves as far as Russia, into China, India. This is still pre-Columbus's discovery, in quotation marks, of Americas. It was an issue in the post-colonial period in Africa. In the 1960s, for example, in Tanzania, particularly on the island of Zanzibar, as the colonists essentially left, and Tanzanians began to assert their own sovereignty. One of the first things that happened is a massive genocide of all the remaining Arabs in Zanzibar, who in the 1960s were rounded up and killed in these kinds of open air massacres reminiscent of the Second World War massacres by the Nazi Einsatz group in Eastern Europe. All this, essentially, these Arab populations in these parts of Africa essentially arrived there on the basis of the slave trade that they were practicing. And of course, on top of the slave trade routes, there were other goods being traded. So these are very rare helicopter shots taken by an Italian film crew in the early 1960s. The only photographs we have of the genocide of Arabs in the island of Zanzibar. As I say, it's off the coast of Tanzania. In fact, Tanzania used to be called Tanganyika, but when Zanzibar and Tanganyika were unified, it became Tanzania. Tanganyika plus Zanzibar, Tanzania. It's with the discovery of the New World by Columbus in 1492 that the pattern for the transatlantic slave trade is going to be set. The Caribbean islands, today Jamaica, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Barbados, with their resources, particularly sugar, become the focus of a huge slave trade for the Spanish and later French and British, the Portuguese as well in South America. There are some attempts to enslave the indigenous Indians, but of course the indigenous island populations are going to die out very quickly from maltreatment and more so from disease. And so that attempt essentially to enslave the indigenous people fails. And moreover, Catholic missionaries, again, on the notion of the Hamitic myth, because indigenous peoples in the Caribbean and South America had lighter skin than Africans, were considered not to be sons of Ham, and by virtue of their lighter skin, indigenous peoples were fated for conversion to Christianity. And so those two things, but I imagine primarily disease, prevented the use of indigenous peoples as slaves. And so you're going to see primarily African slaves now being used for the next 400 years or so of this market. Here you can see those little flags there. Those are various so-called slave factories, which I will discuss a little bit further in the lecture, but those are essentially slave ports or slave fortifications where slaves are essentially packaged and put aboard ships to be sent off like factories off to the Western Hemisphere across the Atlantic. Black slaves will come mostly through West Africa, brought out from the interior often, roughly where today the nations of Senegal, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Sierra Leone, Liberia, the Ivory Coast, Ghana, Togo, Benin, Nigeria, Cameroon, Gabon, Congo, and Angola are located today. Certainly, initially, slaves were kidnapped by slave ship captains who would land at coastal villages and river deltas along the African coast and um, scoop up slaves as prisoners, as captives. But of course, that's not going to work very long. And so, once one slave ship passes by, the second slave ship is not going to get the same welcome on the coast. And so it's essentially a myth that European slave traders made their way deep into Africa, searching out Africans to kidnap and deport out of Africa. Most slaves were actually bought from local African traders. Slavery, as I say, was routinely practiced by African nations in the same way that all the other nations of the world had practiced it. It was a currency of conquest, and very quickly, once these African nations come into contact with Europeans, it not only becomes a currency of conquest, but then it just becomes a currency of economy. Slave traders would form these commercial alliances. First, as I say, with coastal traders, and then later with interior African slave trading nations, which sold slaves they captured not only to Europeans for trade in the Americas, but as well to Arab traders for trade towards the north and the east. The capture of slaves and their sale was very important for the rise of wealthy African kingdoms and empires, like, for example, the Asante Confederacy, who had enslaved their neighbors using firearms provided by the Europeans in exchange for a further supply of slaves. And so it's African kings that begin to build these powerful, vast empires on the backs of neighboring nations, African nations that they conquer and enslave. King Tigabusi of Dahomey, for example, in the 1700s, in the 1750s, will earn approximately 250,000 British pounds a year. That's equivalent today to $40 million a year, selling slaves to European traders. The King Tigabusi of Dahomey had a larger income than the King of England at that point. And here you can see the European traders here paying homage to the king. Slaves would be, in the 1750s, would be sold each by wholesalers in Africa for about 28 to 35 pounds per slave, British pounds. That's equivalent to about $4,480 on the low end to $5,600 on the high end, buying power today, if we calculated when those slaves are then sold in Virginia. Everybody is going to get into the slave trade. And the number one item that's traded for slaves, because often the kings of Africa really didn't need British currency or even gold. It were manufactured goods were the currency of trade. And here you can see some of the major empires, like Congo, like the Asante Empire, that become slave trading kingdoms. But the major item of trade for this kind of slave trade, and again here you can see some of the on the American side, Charleston, for example, 1769, cargo of 94 prime healthy Negroes set to be sold from Sierra Leone, cotton and rice Negroes, prime gang of 25 Negroes accustomed to the culture of Sea Island cotton and rice. You'd see these advertisements posted everywhere. Notice as well these kinds of sanitary measures advertised, kept free from smallpox, no boat having been on board, and all communications with people from Charleston prevented. In any regards, the primary currency of slave trading was the rifle, the musket, or the smoothbore musket. In fact, historian F.W. Hackworth argues that the West African slave trade was the chief client of the entire gun industry in the British Midlands, whose gunsmiths produced most of the 150,000 guns which British ships exchanged annually for African slaves. And so with these guns, African kings would then build their empires and their power bases. What we're talking about here, of course, is the so-called triangular slave trade. And this triangular trade is essential for the expansion of industrialization and modern capitalism, essentially. You have laborers in factories in England working almost as slaves themselves for a pittance of a wage. They're producing goods that they themselves are unable to purchase as just impoverished factory workers. These goods, guns, textiles, for example, from Manchester, textile mills, iron goods, beer, and other items are shipped to Africa. There, they are traded for precious goods like gold, ivory, spices, and hardwoods that immediately return as luxury goods directly to England. But the slaves that are acquired through, as I say, trading guns, textiles, beer, iron, all sorts of manufactured goods from British factories, the slaves are sent out to the West Indies, where then they're sold to plantation owners. And plantation owners in the West Indies, in North America as well, now begin to produce products using slave labor. Things ranging from whale oil, lumber, furs, rice, silk, indigo, tobacco, sugar, molasses, wood. All these goods produced with slave labor are then exported or imported into England and produced with slave labor, those goods are particularly affordable to the workers. And notice how many addictive substances are being produced with slave labor. Coffee, tobacco, sugar, and sugar, of course, becomes the basis of many alcoholic drinks as well. And sugar itself is a highly addictive substance. Some say it's harder to kick a sugar habit than it is to kick a heroin habit. So, you know, workers can't afford the materials that they're producing that are traded to slave kings for slaves, but workers can afford the products that are being produced with slave labor that are being imported from North America and from the West Indies. And this triangular trade now begins to make us very wealthy. That's why Western society and European society is so wealthy compared to the rest of the world, because we had built this system based on the slave factor. Slavery was essential for industrialization. It was essential for the life that we now lead of luxury ourselves here in this society. So that's the triangular slave trade, and why it was so important, and why it's going to be so difficult to abolish slavery. Everybody is going to get into the slave trade. The English, the French, the Dutch, the Danish, the Swedes, the Brandenburg Germans, even the Lithuanians, and the Poles dispatched slave ships to West Africa. The market was very competitive, but highly, highly lucrative. You're looking at the Hawkins map. And this is Captain John Hawkins' map. The English, and of course the United States, is going to inherit its slave system from the British. The English get into the slave trade in 1562 with a venture by Captain John Hawkins. This venture is going to be financially backed by investors from the cream of the English elite. Benjamin Godson, Treasurer of the Royal Navy; Sir Thomas Lodge, Lord Mayor of London; Sir William Winter, Master of the Ordnance of the Royal Navy; Sir Lionel Ducat, the future Lord Mayor of London. All invest in this first slave mission. Queen Elizabeth I will approve and bless the expedition. But then, at the last minute, Queen Elizabeth kind of throws a kink into the system. She calls Captain Hawkins in, and she says, "Oh, by the way, Captain Hawkins, we don't recognize the right of capture of slaves. Make sure that all the slaves that you sell in the New World are actually volunteer for slavery." And of course, Hawkins is, what? This is not the deal. And nonetheless, Hawkins has to deal with it. And so what Hawkins does, his 3 ships now attack Portuguese vessels that already have slaves captured aboard. And so Hawkins says, well, they were already slaves. We didn't have to ask their permission. They were already slaves. So that's kind of the loophole that he finds in Queen Elizabeth's admonition. Hawkins will now smuggle them into Hispaniola, today the island of Haiti and Dominican Republic passed Spanish customs. The Spanish have very tight rules about who can trade slaves in Spanish territories. They have to have the asiento, the assent or license to sell slaves. And so Hawkins, of course, as an English trader, doesn't have that asiento, and so he has to kind of smuggle slave past Spanish customs. He goes to an isolated part of Hispaniola, kind of like a drug dealer almost, contacts local Spanish plantation owners and says, hey, I've got a shipload of slaves that fell off the back of the truck. I can let you have them for a discount. And so these slaves are traded kind of on the black market. That in part, of course, British violations of the asiento in slave trading is one of the reasons we're going to have all these tensions between Britain and Spain. The threat of the Spanish Armada and so forth. The dispute is about the slave trading business, and as I say, British privateer pirates. Violations and smuggling of slaves and so forth. Hawkins will trade these slaves for hides, leather, ginger, sugar, and pearls. When Hawkins returns with that shipment from Hispaniola and liquidates it, he returns a profit of 60% to the investors. And I don't know when's the last time you heard of a 60% yield on your investment, but that's extraordinarily lucrative. And so immediately, everybody in England with that kind of profit margin now jumps into the slave trade. Hawkins himself, here's actually the Hawkins ship. Hawkins himself will be knighted, and the coat of arms that he chooses is one that features a bare-breasted female slave as the stem on his coat of arms. And so at this point, the British slave trade now begins to expand, as I say, into the Caribbean. The issue here is not the trading of slaves, but the trading of products produced by slaves. That's the important economic factor here, what's driving this market. By 1609, the English will settle on Bermuda, eventually in Barbados. They'll go to war with Spain over Jamaica, which will be taken from the Spanish in 1655. And again, the British are settling here. Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, the Carolinas, and Virginia are essentially the British territories where slavery will be practiced. They will be producing essentially rice, tobacco, and cotton there. But as I say, it's a very small comparatively to the 9 million slaves that ended up in the New World. It's a very small margin of the global slave trade, as I say. 360,000 slaves, essentially, tops. You can gauge the weight and wealth of the slave trade by the warehouses, for example, in Liverpool, the Gorey warehouses, which would package materials that are going to be sent off to trade for slaves, and then would again store, warehouse, and distribute all the products that are produced by slave labor re-imported, now imported into Britain from where those plantation nations are producing these goods. These are vast warehouses. They still exist today. This is what they look like. This is, mid 1700s. This is the scale and scope of the slave trade, and they still exist essentially today. So you can just, again, just looking at the architecture, get a sense of just how important this trade, this triangular slave trade was. Eventually, the king seizes control of the slave trade. Corporations will be formed with monopolies. The largest monopoly is held by the Royal African Company, the RAC. Its headquarters is on Broad Street in London in a building still known as Africa House. They own the Gorey warehouses I had just shown you in Liverpool. The RAC will become one of the largest joint stock companies in the world. Some 200 of England's elites are going to invest in the RAC. Its largest shareholder and CEO or governor is James Stuart, the Duke of York, who in 1685 is going to become the King of England, James II. The directors of the RAC include 4 plantation owners in the Carolina. They include Lord Shaftesbury, who in 1679 is going to draft the Habeas Corpus Act that is so important in our judicial system today, and actually is going to figure prominently in anti-slavery struggles of the future, both in Britain and the United States. Here you can actually see the Royal African Company corporate charter. Shareholders of RAC are going to include 15 of the Lord Mayors of London in future years, 25 sheriffs of London, and even the very philosopher of liberty, John Locke. So in the first 28 years of RAC's operations, the RAC between 1672 and 1700 transports approximately 100,000 African slaves across the Atlantic. The problem that the RAC faces making this profitable are independent slave traders, the so-called 10%ers, because they pay a 10% tax on goods that they import into England produced from the slave trade. So while the RAC, for example, between 1698 and 1707 trades in 18,000 slaves in that maybe 10-year period, 9-year period. The 10%ers in the same period traded 75,000 slaves. So it gives us some sense of the scale of human traffic and kind of the competition